So welcome back. Now we have a keynote speech by Professor Joe Harrington. The speech will be about methods for analyzing data in order to detect cartels. Professor Harrington is Professor of Economics at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, and one of the world's leading authorities on collusion and cartels. He is the co-author of a well-known landmark textbook, Economics of Regulation and Antitrust. He has published extensively on top journals. He's also the winner of the Antitrust Writing Award established by Concurrence, and he recently wrote and co-author a book on a very interesting topic, which is hub and spoke cartel. Joe, I will leave the floor to you. You have roughly 40 minutes, 45 minutes to make your presentation, so to have some time for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo. It certainly is a pleasure to be back in Rome, and particularly at a Lear conference. I think we know from this morning's panel session that cartel screening is something that is well known out there, but in the event that you haven't gotten the memo, I'm going to kind of presume you don't know about cartel screening, tell you a bit about it, but also tell you about what's going on the frontier. And actually, there's been a kind of slight change in the title of the talk. As you see there, it's the role of data and text analysis in cartel detection, which I didn't tell you about, which is, I think, a kind of an exciting new venue for pursuing the pursuit of detecting cartels. So cartel screening is the analyzing of market data and text for the purpose of discovering cartels. And it's very important, particularly in a room with lawyers, and if you're not familiar with cartel screening, to understand what the deliverable is. It is not to give you the evidence to convict indicted firms. Rather, it's to tell you that an investigation should be initiated. That is to help identify, out of the thousands of markets out there, why these few markets are ones that we think there might be a cartel and warrant investigation. So that's really the role of screening, that initial step in terms of a case. This has become now really kind of widely used in various venues. I just give a few of the known examples of which cartels previously unknown have been discovered, some by competition authorities, some by scholars, some by journalists, some intentional, some unintentional. But the point is, we have the cases to show that it works. Now, there's different flavors of screening or different general approaches. And the approach that really has been used and been shown to be effective is behavioral screening. So this is an approach based on identifying patterns in firm conduct and outcomes. And I'll be more specific about that in a moment. Now, behavioral screening, as I said, can work. And it can work for two very broad reasons. One is that if collusion is to be profitable, there has to be a change in the price generating process, or if it's an auction, the bid generating process. Because if there's no change from what was occurring prior to cartelization, well, then it's not going to be profitable. Okay, so there's got to be a change in it, and in principle, it's detectable. The second reason why behavioral screening can work is that collusion is challenging. There's a lot of obstacles to firms to maintain the stability of the cartel, to coordinate an outcome, and how they solve those challenges leaves an evidentiary trail. Okay. Now, it's been noted that, well, if there's cartel screening going on, that it can be gamed. And there are a few screens that really, really smart, clever cartels could potentially beat, but for most screens, it's costly for the firms to try to beat the cartel. And that is, for them to make it look less like a cartel, they need to make it look more like competition, which means foregoing some collusive profits. So they face a trade-off. So even if the cartels are very savvy, very strategic, at most they can reduce the power of screens, but they cannot eliminate it entirely. I'm going to, as part of kind of a learning disabilities when you get older, I'm going to have to be confusing the button whereby it affects my microphone with what affects the screen. Okay, so just raise your hand if I've kind of turned off the power to the microphone. Okay, now this is actually not the first time that I've spoken about cartel screening in Rome at Lear. In fact, I did so back in 2005, and all the talks at that conference made up the chapters of the Handbook of Antitrust Economics, which Paolo edited. Now, since 2005, there's been, I would say, two broad developments which make cartel screening even more compelling. One is on the supply side. That is, we've developed new methods, and some of those I'll kind of review and present today. But the other is on the demand side. And to kind of explain what I mean by that, let's go back to 2005. And I distinctly remember after my talk, a prominent Department of Justice economist and lawyer who recently retired came up to me and said, why do we need to screen? We have plenty of cases through the leniency program. Now, putting aside the fact that he was, just by his nature argumentative, the fact is it's not a very compelling reason to look for more cases just because right now you have plenty of cases. But even if we put that, say, okay, well, let's put that as kind of a point aside, that excuse is really no longer relevant, which is something we heard, at this morning's panel. These are just a few kind of anecdotes kind of substantiating that. This past June, the International Cartel Workshop of the American Bar Association, it was noted that leniency applications are down a lot. If you look at the European Commission, from 2014 to 2018, down from 46 to 17. A short time ago, the head of the German Competition Authority kind of made this point, and you can see the drastic decline in leniency applications in Germany, attributed to the development of damages. But whatever is the source of it, the fact is that the leniency program is less active. And if it's less active, we probably think it's less effective. So this just really more makes the case for alternative methods for uncovering cartels. Okay, so this is just a broad overview of the talk. I'm going to do a little bit on screening methods, and that's going to be kind of reviewed to a lot of people in this room. Then I'll talk about the use of machine learning, which is, I think, an important and very promising direction. And then talk about its relevance for text analysis, which is really not developed at all, but I think, once again, it's kind of an exciting application of it. But before doing so, let me just make a point in terms of, well, who should be listening and who should be checking their email. Competition authorities, obviously, in fact, they're doing this, as we heard, and it certainly is the case. But there might still be some things I say that they haven't heard, and I bet there's things that they've done which I haven't heard, but such is the nature of it. But I think other parties should be interested in engaging in screening. Private companies. It's well known Deutsche Bahn started a cartel detection unit in response to the fact that they've been the victim of a number of input cartels among their input suppliers. I can say that recently I assisted a major international corporation to have their own cartel detection unit, which unfortunately they aren't allowing me to say who they are, and I'm sure there's other ones. And the point is that if you're a large corporation buying a lot of commodities, probably you're the victim of a cartel. Well, you might as well get kind of proactive on it and see if you can find any evidence of it, which either can be delivered to a competition authority, or in some jurisdictions like the US, you can just directly go to private litigation. The other parties I've mentioned here are economic consultancies and plaintiff law firms, and this might be more relevant to the US because they are not dependent upon just pursuing follow-on cases. Many cartel cases, collusion cases, are pursued by private litigants without any case pursued by the Department of Justice or FTC. So, if you're looking for business, right now, economists have some spare time. It would be a good use of it to get a hold of some data sets and see in some suspected markets, likely suspects like cement and chemicals, and see if you can find evidence of a cartel. So I think there's many parties that really are impacted by collusion, either they're harmed by it, or it's part of their mandate as with competition authorities, or that they're engaged in these cases, such as consultancies and law firms, that could benefit from cartel screening. Okay, so let's get into screening methods. So to engage in cartel screening, you need data, you need to know what to look for in the data. And for this to be something that is, passes a cost-benefit analysis, the data should be easily accessible, should be simple, like prices, bids, and that's the most common type of data that's used. Could also be quantities and market shares, other ones. And then there's, in terms of what to look for in the data, and there's basically 3 different approaches. Exclusive markers, which refer to patterns that are more consistent with collusion than competition. There are structural breaks, which indicate a change in the, for example, price-generating process. That could be due to cartel birth, death, or disruption. And then there's just these anomalies, which are just these patterns which are clearly inconsistent with competition. It's not immediately clear they're consistent with collusion, but they may, in some of these cases, are determined to be the product of a cartel. Okay, so there's a whole lot of exclusive markers that have been developed. I just listed a number of them here. I'm not going to go through all these. In fact, I'm just going to go through one to really just kind of illustrate what is meant by that. But there's a lot of patterns that have been recognized, and they all come from the fact that, well, cartels operate differently from competitive industries. Okay, so what I'm going to focus upon is low price variability. You think about a competitive market, or just say, when I say that, it's a non-cartelized market. Price changes, a firm changes price when there's a non-trivial change in its cost or in demand. That's what's driving the price changes. But what drives price changes for a cartel is very different. They can't just, a cartel member can't just on its own just change price when there's an agreement on price. So it's going to tend to be more common cost and demand changes. When they want to change price, they're going to have to communicate and coordinate on it. And then they're going to have to do so in a way that's constrained by the condition that the cartel remains stable. And so all those kind of additional considerations result in price being changed less frequently and prices being less variable over time. So just to give you 2 examples of this. If we look at the one on the left, that's on the frozen perch cartel type of fish in the US. So what's depicted there is the top line is price, the bottom line is cost. If you look at it during the competitive phase, after the cartel collapsed to give us a competitive benchmark, you see that price moves around a fair amount. Well, it's because cost moves around a fair amount. Demand may also be changing. If you look at it under collusion, what you see there is a far more stable price series. And it's not something that can be kind of explained by a more stable cost series than really occurred after the cartel. So that's just what I mean by kind of a less variable price under collusion. Okay. On the right is from the urethane cartel, foam, which is used, for example, in car seats. On the right of that graph is, you can ignore the green line. There's a red and blue line, and the red line is price, the blue line is cost. And you can see they pretty much move together under competition, as you would expect. On the left part of that graph, you see that red line is fairly flat, very little movement, even though there's been large changes in cost over that time period. Well, that's just what I'm referring to when I say low price variability under collusion. Not all cartels have this, but enough do that it becomes an effective collusive marker. So, and more specifically, in terms of the marker, is to cast it as the coefficient of variation of price. So what the coefficient of variation is of a variable, a random variable, is just the standard deviation of price divided by the mean of price. So the standard deviation price measures variability. So if we find that cartels reduce variability, that's going to reduce the standard deviation, and that's going to reduce the numerator to the coefficient of variation. Of course, we know that collusion raises price, so that's going to raise the mean price, and that raises the denominator to the coefficient of variation. So there's two forces operating there to suggest that a low coefficient of variation, either relevant to some benchmark or just over time, that can be an effective marker that there's a cartel present. Going back to that frozen perch cartel, I can become more specific in terms of numbers. Let's see. I would like to point to these. I'm just going to slide over for a moment. Let's see. Okay. So, oops. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So if we look down here, there we go. Okay. Costs went up 7% between collusion and competition. Prices went down 16% from collusion and competition. Okay, so we're seeing that prices are higher under collusion, and it can't be explained by cost. But what I really want to point out here is that the coefficient of variation is just drastically higher under competition, or alternatively lower under collusion. So, there it's, more than 3 times higher under competition than collusion. Okay, that's a really drastic change, and that's something which can be kind of, as I said, effective as a collusive marker. Let me turn to structural breaks. So once again, this is a change in the data generating process, like for prices and bids, associated with cartel action. We know when the cartel is created, prices are going to have to go up, otherwise why form a cartel? Of course, once again, the cartelists can be rather strategic about this and manipulate how they raise price, knowing they don't want to tip off to their customers, particularly if they're industrial customers, that a cartel has formed. But still, there's going to be a limit to that. Cartel death provides a particularly kind of a good opportunity to detect collusion, because you expect price to fall significantly, and here the cartel doesn't have the capacity to manipulate that price decline because, well, it's collapsed. And so cartel death is often something that can be easily assessed by examining the data. And there also can be periodic disruption of the cartel. And so there, what's happening, there's significant changes in variables like prices and bids, because you're going from a point where they're being set by a collusive price setting process to where they're being set by a competitive price setting process. So let me give you a couple examples. This first one here occurred in Mexico with the public health provider, where they were running procurement auctions for the purchase of generic drugs. So I'm not going to, this study here was looking at the 20 top-selling drugs, and as we'll see on the next slide, for 2 of those drugs, the drastic change in the winning bids, for the 2 drugs that I'll show. So on the left is insulin, on the right calcium. You see that vertical line there. To the left of that is when the cartel was in place, and you see the winning bids are just, very, well, you don't know that they're high, but they're certainly very stable over time. And then all of a sudden, when you look to the right of that vertical line, not only are winning bids much lower, but they're also much more variable. Same thing is true if you look at calcium on the right-hand side. Now, you don't have to hire an expensive, kind of economist or statistician to be able to figure out that there's been a change in the winning bid generating process. And it's hard to come up with an alternative explanation than the fact that there was a cartel, which we are unaware of, and now it's collapsed. Another example of a structural break is from work from David Imhoff, who I'll mention again later on in the talk. So here he's looking at construction tenders in Switzerland. And what we have data on here, as you can see, there's 3 phases. The one to the left of the first vertical line on the left is during the pre-cartel phase, then you have the cartel phase, and you have the post-cartel phase. And once again, what's being plotted here is actually the coefficient of variation of bids for an individual tender. How variable are the bids for a particular tender? So a different kind of measure of coefficient of variation to what I referred to before. Again, just plot this. You can see, there's a real change. You just don't see those high coefficient of variation of bids during what we now know as a cartel phase, as opposed to before and after it. Okay? And the third example I'm going to give is instead of one of cartel disruption, and I particularly like this one. So this is from Japanese procurement auctions. These are by local governments for road paving contracts. The procurer would set a maximum allowed bid and a minimum allowed bid. The data set had about, well, it had 123 auctions, and, it had 139. Of those, 123 of them had the winning bid, fairly close to the maximum allowed bid, about 91 and 95% of it, which I also referred to as the reserve price there. But the other 16 auctions were drastically different in that the winning bid was exactly at the minimum allowed bid. So let's look at the figure here. So what we have here on the horizontal axis are all the different tenders, 139 of them. The black dots are the winning bids. The X's are the minimum allowed bids. And if there's a circle around an X, I do that because that's where the black dot is on top of the X. So the winning bid is equal to the minimum allowed bid. Now, what I want to point out is you have all these auctions where the winning bid is, as I said, around 93 to 95% of the maximum allowed bid. And then you got these other 16 auctions where the winning bid is equal to the minimum allowed bid. And there's nothing in between. It's hard to, I cannot think of a competitive bidding process that would generate this type of pattern. And what's driving this is there's generally a stable cartel, but every now and then, two construction companies would participate in the tender who were not part of the cartel. And all of a sudden, bidding would go from collusive to very competitive. And that's what we see. So once again, that kind of switching, you just simply cannot explain by a competitive process. And so what all these examples have really shown thus far, I would hope, is that in some cases, it's just a matter of collecting and plotting the data to see that with high likelihood, there's a cartel. Or, in some of these cases, there was a cartel. So the third category is anomalies. And I'll just give one example here. And this is just something which is, as I said, it's inexplicable. It's something which certainly is contrary to competition, because this with collusion is going to require a bit of thought. And so this is once again a study based upon procurement auctions in Japan. They have thousands of observations, which really is very helpful. And what is being plotted here are the bids of one of those bidders over a lot of these auctions, Mitsubishi Electric. And the variable that's being plotted here is Mitsubishi's bid minus the lowest bid of all the other bidders in the tender. So if that variable is negative, so you're down here, that's when Mitsubishi Electric submitted the lowest bid, okay? So its bid was lower than the lowest bid of everyone else. And if it's over here where it's positive, that's where they did not submit the lowest bid. And what's being measured here is how much higher they are than the lowest bid. Now, what's striking about this distribution is the missing bids around zero. That Mitsubishi Electric seems to, not bid when it's kind of close to or at the lowest bid, that there aren't other bids near it. And this could be even more easily seen visually if we plot the bids for all the bidders, and once again, that same graph. I think we can all see that we expect a kind of a smooth distribution here, but we're just missing these bids. And once again, no competitive process can explain that. Why are bids? There are no bids around there. And in fact, competition predicts just the opposite. If a bidder knew that when it had turned out to have the lowest bid, the next highest bid was some discrete amount above it, as this data predicts, well, then it'd be in its best interest to bid a little bit higher, knowing that it would still win. Now, the explanation is, in fact, that there was a bid rigging cartel. And there was someone who's designated to submit the lowest bid. They conveyed what they're going to bid to the other members of the cartel. And those other members always bid a distinct amount above that, just to ensure that the designated winner would win. Okay, and that's what created, this gap of missing bids. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, the first part of the talk is just cartel screening can be done with simple data, prices, bids, can Sometimes simple statistics is sufficient, or maybe just plotting. Other times you need, more methods. But the point is that, that it doesn't necessarily require a high level of sophistication. I think to, have a very effective unit, you do want to have that high level of sophistication to be able to automate it and make it very efficient. Okay, so thus far I've talked about various, kind of methods like collusive markers and structural breaks. So these are, some have been shown to be useful screens. It'd be nice to find what is the most effective screen. And that's the kind of research is going on right now to answer that question using machine learning. So here the idea is that you collect bid data where some of the tenders and which ones involved a cartel, and some of the tenders did not. So we have data of cartels and data of where bids are generated by competition. And then we want to use machine learning techniques to find out, well, what's the best way to identify the presence of a cartel based on that data, because it's data for which we know where there was a cartel and where there was not. So the first, to my knowledge, published study in this area was by Martin Huber and David Imhoff. And so they looked at this with bid rigging cartels on road construction and maintenance in Switzerland. So what they have data on are 4 cartels, and they have, for example, for Cartel A, 148 tenders where they knew there was a cartel, and 33 where they know there was competition. And over the 4 cartels, they have a fair number of observations, about half and half that are collusion and half are competition. So what you then do is say, okay, let's identify some variables for the algorithm to kind of use to find, in essence, the best formula for predicting that there was a cartel or there was collusion, or competition. So they included, for example, the coefficient of variation of bids, which you can see here is indeed much lower for collusion and competition, as we saw before. They looked at the second lowest bid minus the lowest bid, find that that's higher under collusion than competition. That's consistent with the missing bids that I just gave, and just a whole other variables, some of which we don't really necessarily know might be useful, but just another way to characterize the data. And so you put those variables into your machine learning algorithm, and as I said, it in essence finds what's the best way to use those variables to predict that this tender was a cartel and this tender was not. So what they did was this is the standard practice, use some part of your data for learning, in this case 75%, and then use 25% to test the performance of that particular algorithm. And you just do that a whole lot of times to find out, okay, what's the best formula for predicting or distinguishing between collusion and competition. Okay? So, if we say we classify a tender as being collusive when the estimated probability exceeds 0.5, then we can see, well, how well does the machine learning produced algorithm do in terms of distinguishing collusion and competition? And in this study, it does fairly well. We're looking at, basically, let's say an accuracy of somewhere in the mid-80s. So that is, if there, truly is a cartel there, there's about a 85% chance it'd be properly classified, 15% chance it'll be instead predicted to be collusion competition when it's actually collusion. And it also does it very well in terms of identifying competition. The algorithm is doing a pretty good job. There's other studies which shows even other ones that can do even better. But the fact is, these are very promising results that if you have the data, and we have the techniques, that you can use that to come up with yet more effective screens than what are admittedly kind of ad hoc screens, which are kind of made based upon our economic understanding more broadly. Okay. I think I'm going to skip over that. And finally, just on this point, that there's a recent study which put together 6 data sets, 2 of the ones used by David Imhoff and some of his colleagues, but also ones from several other countries, tried a whole bunch of different machine learning algorithms, different markers, and in this case, they used 80% of the data to train the algorithm, 20% to test for performance. And again, the overall performance is quite good. So they are able to accurately kind of classify the tenders more than 80% of the time. And the false positives, false negatives, so false negative here is to classify a tender as collusive when it's actually competitive. False positive, classify a tender as competitive when it's collusive. These are under 10%. So this work is just really starting, but it's certainly work that more work is to be done and can be done because there's lots of data sets out there to use it on. Let me just say on this point that if you are interested in kind of learning more about what I've kind of just reviewed thus far, both in terms of just general methods and machine learning, David and I just had a paper published. It's actually out now in the Stanford Computational Antitrust online journal. Now, it's clear from this morning's panel that there's already a lot of work going on by competition authorities to look for bidding rings and procurement auctions. There are terms like market intelligence units and the like. And so they've been, indeed very active on this. I know Brazil was a competition authority that was active very early on. So there's lots out there that are doing this, and there's good reasons for why it's occurring there. The data's available, at least in principle it's available from the procurers. Not always a trivial exercise to get it or get it in good shape. As I said, we've had a developed set of screens because there's been a lot of studies done with regards to procurement auctions. One of the challenges with cartel screening is you may pick up tacit collusion, not explicit collusion. That's generally not a problem, I would say, with bidding rings at procurement auctions or auctions in general. It's very, very rare that any sort of collusion in an auction setting is anything but explicit. I know of only one case that I've run into that you could possibly argue that there was not express communication. And finally, bidding rings are common. And to give you a little anecdote in terms of how common they are, I stumbled across the following in a industry guide called Construction, Planning, Programming, and Control. And this is all about construction, but they had a chapter about bidding at tenders. And I want to focus upon this fourth bullet point here, and this is when they deal with the issue of degree of competition. It says, do we want the work or should we take a covered price? That is an arrangement whereby one contractor is given a price by another contractor, which is then submitted as a tender offer. The price will be sufficiently realistic to look like a bona fide tender, but high enough so as not to win the contract. It says something to me about the ubiquity of cover bids when someone puts it into a manual. Okay. Now, what's also interesting is that this is from the second edition, which I've reproduced that same passage here. On the third edition, they simply say, do we want the work? So I suspect that one of you all, or someone like you, got a hold of the authors of this book and said, you probably don't want to put that in there. So, okay. But it really does. I think it seriously does tell me about how common the practice is of cover bidding. Okay, so let's get to the last topic, which admittedly is a plug for my own research, but I think this really is a kind of an exciting area, which is text analysis associated with public announcements. Okay, and in fact, Giannis at this morning's panel really kind of touched upon this point, and I know that he's kind of looking into it. So here are public announcements. We're talking about earnings calls, press releases, financial reports, interviews in trade journals, all sorts of venues by which companies provide information to people outside their firm. Okay. Now, there are two kind of categories of announcements that could raise concerns that they might facilitate coordinated conduct to reduce competition. One is referencing a firm's own conduct. So this would be kind of the classic example is a firm making advanced price announcements, and that as a form of kind of riskless price leadership. That's been kind of a concern. We're not really quite sure how to deal with it from a competition policy perspective. But the one that I'm going to focus upon today is really much more egregious, even though there really hasn't been the cases. I shouldn't say the public prosecution cases, there have been private litigation cases, which is to reference rival firms' conduct. You can already see that's immediately a bit problematic when a firm starts talking about rivals in terms of their conduct. Now, there are, I should say this, what I'm going to present here is in a paper I just was published of mine in an antitrust law journal. In the paper, there's actually referred to 3 categories by which a firm references rival firms' conduct and how that could potentially be facilitating collusion. Here, the third is one which there hasn't been any examples, so I'm not going to cover that today. But the first 2, there have been a number of cases. The first one is when a firm announces how it will behave in response to rival firms' conduct, and there are the cases listed that I've been able to find. And the other is even more problematic, where a firm announces how rivals firms should behave. So let me give you an example of the first category. This is a case on this side of the Atlantic, mobile telecom, and this came up in an interview with one of the 3 major companies in that market, executive or KPN. So there was at least three important takeaways when you read that interview, if I look at it from a competition perspective. First of all, they make the statement that competition is too intense in this market. He says that operators have focused too heavily on increasing their market shares by reducing prices. Then effectively it proposes a inclusive plan. Says KPN has a market share of around 50%, and we are happy with that. We will carefully start raising prices this year. And that sounded like a market allocation. Okay, 50%, that's our market. We're going to raise prices. And the third one is where the kind of announcement relevant to rival firms comes in, when he says, if we will be punished by the markets and our market share will be immensely under pressure, then we will have to make other plans. Well, that says to me that, yes, if you don't follow up our price increase and we lose market share, which we will if you don't follow it because this is a homogeneous service, we're going to lower our price. Okay. There are, as I said, a number of other cases in this category. They all have these 2 features. That a common problem is stated, which is basically there's too much competition. In freestanding newspaper inserts, it was a declining price of environment. Or in one-way truck rentals, pricing well below cost. And then there's a solution proposed, which is basically, I will lead on price, and you will need to follow, and that can often be cast in, I'm not going to keep price up if I lose market share. Okay, so let's go now to the other category, which is where a firm announces how rival firms should behave. And there's several cases here. I'm going to just describe the airlines case. There's a steel case, which is almost identical in the critical features. So what you have is a lot of announcements at earnings calls, industry meetings of the following sort. AirTran CEO says, the only certain way to get the average prices up is to accompany it with capacity adjustments. A Delta president said, I said no in terms of has enough capacity been cut. Everybody's watching each other in terms of how the capacity coming over and exactly what's coming out. Key there is everybody. And then the Delta VP in earnings call says, I think Delta can't do it alone. I would say if the industry could achieve a 10% reduction in capacity year over year by the fall, that we'd be in pretty good shape. And once again, the problem here is, it's fine to say that your capacity is going to go down by 10%. It's problematic when you say the industry capacity couldn't come down by 10%. There were later announcements which were basically, I would say, providing evidence of effect, but I think they also serve to kind of confirm, or affirm the underlying agreement. So the United Chief Financial Officer said, what we have seen so far is very good overall behavior in terms of capacity discipline on the part of the industry. American Airlines CEO, there are hopeful signs that the industry has learned its lesson about keeping capacity growth in line with demand. And Delta President, we are doing our share at maintaining the overall discipline across our structure, and we would expect our competitors hopefully to do the same. Okay, this is all about capacity discipline, and that this is an industry plan that has to be implemented. Now, we don't have to just rely upon looking at these announcements. There's been a very nice study done showing cause and effect. So what they did here, and this gets me now to the issue of text analysis. What they did here was that they took their earnings calls for the 11 largest basically airlines in the U.S. over a 14-year period, and using various methods, some AI, some by hand, identified words or phrases that could facilitate coordination. And so these were looking for terms like capacity associated with demand or capacity discipline. And so then they basically look for these in the earnings calls. And just to give you an example, here's one from US Airways. Passenger revenue was up 11.4% as a result of the strong pricing environment and continued industry capacity discipline. So that would be classified as a message which is, quote, referring to capacity discipline, unquote. So now, having identified them, the issue is, do we see effect in terms of the actual capacity? And so what they did was to see, well, let's suppose all the airlines on a particular route had a message in their earnings call where they were referring to capacity discipline as just defined. Do we see any effect on the number of seats they offer in the next quarter? And the answer is yes. There's a decline in the number of seats, a decline in capacity by 1.45% in the next quarter. And that's not small relative to what is the normal variation in the number of seats, which is 3.78%. Okay, so here we see some text analysis, and we see evidence of effect. Let's see here. Let me skip over that for the sake of time. But let me just say here that this kind of text analysis, in the case of airlines, it's the only evidence of coordination is through these announcements. And that is an avenue that can be pursued, certainly in the US, and it could be pursued here as well. But I say in the US, it's basically be done through private litigation. But the example I skipped was on generic drugs, where there were also these types of public announcements, which were rather, I'd say, facilitating coordination. But the fact is, there was private communication as well. So the public announcements were supplementing the private communications. Now, that's really important in terms from a cartel screening perspective. If that is going on, then the identification through text analysis of these types of messages might actually indicate just a good old-fashioned cartel, whether meeting and directly communicating. Okay. The final point I'm going to make here for my concluding slide is say that this issue has been picked up and starting to get some attention. The Capitol Forum is a subscription-based news, investigative news organization in Washington, D.C. They saw my paper when it was a working paper, became interested in it, and so now they've created a little unit where they're examining earnings calls, and once they've identified some suspicious-looking earnings calls, then they'll send them out to experts like myself and others for commentary, and then they'll kind of publish this as part of their newsletter. Okay, so let me conclude. As I said, I referred to the start of my talk to speaking about cartel screening in 2005. And also in 2005, a prominent official for the Department of Justice gave a presentation and had that image in his slides, which says, you can't catch a thief with an economist. This is in response to cartel screening. And I have to say, with not a very flattering image of an economist, so either enamored or confused by numbers. Well, yes, you cannot catch a thief with an economist, but you can find out that there was a crime with an economist. And that's the purpose of screening. To find out that, well, in fact, those prices that you were paying in that market, those actually may be the product of a cartel. So identifying the crime is the first step, and that is the role of screening, and then it's up to kind of the lawyers to then take that to investigation and prosecution, deliver evidence to then convict. And with that, I will end. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to entertain them. Yes?
Thank you very much, Sabine Zigelski, OECD. Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation, and it was super interesting to listen, and particularly text analysis. Would you agree, your opinion, these days in our high inflationary environment that we're facing now, I think you just have to read the newspaper, and every day I keep finding announcements by industry associations. We may have to increase them. Is it a general tendency to increase prices here and there? And my suspicion is there's a lot of piggybacking on an accepted inflationary excuse going on. Would there be some value in being very intense on this kind of signaling and tax analysis right now? And should agencies do that?
Yeah, I certainly think this is an environment that one has to be concerned that the announcements themselves might facilitate the price increases. So, let me say, my initial reaction, and I've kind of thought about this, it's kind of a mixture. I think back to, many investigations of high prices in gasoline markets. I remember the Portuguese Competition Authority were kind of, I understand, there was political pressure to investigate it, and this is true in a lot of countries because people see the high gasoline prices. A lot of the investigations didn't find any cartels, but there were high prices. They were driven by other things. So you do have to be concerned with that, and that could well be driving a lot of the price increases. Now, of course, you see price increases that are well above the inflation rate. That's a concern. But then also, kind of going back to what you were saying, what you don't want to see is any sort of announcements that might facilitate that. And I think, indeed, my overall view is that we've given firms much too leeway on this. Yes, they have responsibility to the capital markets, investment community to tell what their firm is doing and informing them in that regard. There is no responsibility, fiduciary or otherwise, on them to suggest what other firms should be doing or to do anything that would affect the prices of other firms. So I think that would be, kind of dealing with my concern about unjustified investigations, particularly ones that, driven by political pressure, would perhaps be really to focus on those announcements and to really, make sure that those things are indeed just purely price announcements and are nothing suggestive of the industry at large. Yeah. Let's see.
Just following up on this one, this is really an area which you haven't covered in your presentation because you said I'm not going to deal with that. It's basically a company announcing their own future pricing, so not actually how their competitors should behave. In the context that you just mentioned, so if you have, let's say, a company that says, well, announces in a newspaper, we will actually increase our prices in 2 months by that percent. How will you go with this specific type of announcement in case, for instance, this is a product which the consumers are not, you cannot buy like a few months in advance. It's basically something that, cannot be maintained or kept or whatever. It's like immediate consumption. Will you go and say, well, what's the point of this announcement? How will you analyze this a little bit more difficult situation about, a company, announcing their own basically pricing in the future?
Yes, and what I've been talking about here is something which, though it's been out there for a while, it hasn't really been examined. The advanced price announcements that you're referring to, Giannis, I mean, I know in the US there was an airlines case going back several decades, and we still haven't really dealt with it from a policy perspective. So, I don't want to give a quick answer on that because I think that really does need a careful investigation. It hasn't helped us, certainly I can think about in the US at least, that these cases are just simply settled or they're if it's a private case or you just get a consent decree or a settlement, because it doesn't help us get resolution through case law in terms of, well, how exactly should we handle these? Should the burden be on the firms to justify that this is a value to consumers, because that's their real defense there, that this is a value to consumers. So you could imagine a situation that says, well, the burden is on you to do that. And it won't be difficult, just go out there and show us that consumers can easily access it, and there's some evidence that they're using it in their purchasing decisions. So all I can say is that I think it is time for us to sit down and come up with a rubric to analyze these things, because not only is that useful from a competition policy perspective, but yes, we have to give predictability to the companies as well. So, so thank you for raising that as a topic which, I did not cover. So, let's see.
Tilman Mackert from Deutsche Bahn. You mentioned, and this is quite true, that we developed a cartel screening tool within our group, but we have, with a purchasing volume of around 40 billion a year, we've got a lot of data. And I wonder how the cartel authorities could use their algorithms, and where do they get their data from? Is it that we need some kind of decentralized cartel detection in future, where we have a close cooperation between big corporations and cartel authorities? Or do we have some kind of cooperation where the cartel authorities get their data from? Or do you have any such suggestions on that?
Yeah, so I certainly have been thinking about it in terms of data availability under the current state of the world, which seems to be either publicly available data. And let me say here, I mean, sometimes government price indices can reveal cartels. I can think about the German cement case was the case in point. And then the other one is like with government procurement, so the data is elsewhere within the government. Yeah, it does raise a problem because we know a lot of cartels occur with commodities, intermediate goods, and a lot of those prices are negotiated. So those are proprietary to the companies and thus would not be open to, to the competition authority or anyone else for that matter. So, I mean, that's a bit of a challenge, in terms of how do you get at that data. Now, of course, on the plaintiff side, you could potentially get into it because, you have some of the buyer's data, But to me, I see it as a challenge. I don't know how one necessarily fixes that, because you do have to, there's a confidentiality to that which is justified, and so that is a challenge. So there was a question here. So.
Thank you for your illustration. I mean, my question is not that far from what Lianos just asked you, but I mean, I am Andrea Pezzoli from the Italian Competition Authority. I fully agree that cartel screening is not intended to catch a thief, but rather to show there was or there might be a crime. Because my question is, how can we distinguish the behaviors of the other players of the market, the potential members of the cartel, I mean, between a rational adjustment or just after a public announcement? I can argue that, I mean, my behavior is an autonomous behavior, an independent behavior. So, I mean, of course, I fully took advantage from the public announcement, but, I mean, I'm not a member. There is no coordination. So there is the thin line between tacit and explicit collusion.
Yes. Okay.
How can we cross such a line?
Yeah. So the way I would cast it, if I understand you correctly, I mean, the concern would be one firm makes a public announcement about, let's say, the industry. Okay. Other firms do not make any announcements. The firm made the announcement, raises their price, the other firms follow it. Okay. And I agree, that's a difficult case. So what I would look for, though, is like in the airline cases, Steele's, when the other firms also make those types of announcements, or make any sort of announcement which could be interpreted as acceptance of an invitation. Other than that, you're right. That the other firm was just pursuing his best interest, did not contribute to the facilitation of an agreement. And then we're kind of back into the problem of just of no announcements, basically. Okay, and price signaling.
Alan Riley, Energy Community. My question was simply, with this sort of evidence, supposing you're an agency and you want to use this evidence to carry out a raid, is there any indication that a flinty-eyed federal district judge or a flinty-eyed high court judge would be able, any indication, any cases that they actually would look at this and go, this is very interesting, but am I actually going to issue a warrant on the basis of such information? Are you really going to need something else in addition to this? And I don't know, is there any case law on this in terms of this being used at least as part of an application for a warrant? Yeah,
so there's there's two cartel types here. One is let's just take the airlines for what it was, where there's only public announcements. You know, I actually think there's enough evidence there that it should be convincing, because we have announcements by all the firms, we have evidence of effect. Okay, but now let's say we're thinking of, well, no, these are public announcements are part of a broader communication, and that there's kind of evidence of actually direct communication of the type that's, you know, clearly unlawful. You know, all I can say is that, yes, this will not be sufficient, you know, but it's not cast as such. Once again, it's kind of you can think of it as a screening device to say, okay, we see these public announcements. We know, like in generic drugs, they had these types of public announcements associated with private communications. You know, can we find the other type of evidence that would be sufficient to convince a judge to engage in a dawn raid or, you know, discovery? Yeah, so it would need to be something else from that perspective. Though let me say, on the article that I developed in the Antitrust Law Journal is really just taking this, that these are all the announcements, you know, and making the case that there can be enough evidence here to show that there is communication which is outside of the competitive framework. You know, that's really key here, and that's what prevents, you know, us from prosecuting someone who raises, you have Richard Posner's canonical situation, a gasoline station raises their price to invite the one across the street to also raise their price, and they do, and that's acceptance of that invitation. You know, you can't prosecute that because moving around price is part of the competitive process. My point is that talking about your rival firm's conduct is not part of that. And so we can distinguish, you know, that, and it's just a matter of, you know, do we see the announcements that are sufficiently compelling? But going back to your point of more of a more standard cartel, and these types of announcements are used in conjunction, yeah, it will have to be some other evidence to kind of get that dawn raid or you know, the right to engage in discovery. Okay, I guess it's 3 o'clock, so we should end. Is that correct, Paolo? Okay. Okay, thanks.